Substance and Process, an Outline, by Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, 2020. Does something underlie or substantiate, or is change itself fundamental without need for a substratum? Is there being below becoming, or is becoming below being? To adopt the first response is to adopt substance metaphysics. To adopt the second is to adopt process metaphysics or process philosophy. In physics, a general shift from substance to process thought was suggested by the realization that electromagnetism did not require an underlying luminiferous ether. Light required no crutches. In biology, there occurred the parallel realization with the theory of evolution. A species had no underlying static pre-extant design, but rather each species was a transitive phase in a cosmically long process. In metaphysics, the idea that there was a substance, often as matter, underlying all change and thus not itself susceptible to change, was progressively questioned and replaced by thinkers as ostensibly diverse as Leibniz, Hegel, Peirce, Dewey, James, Nietzsche, Bergson, culminating in the systematic process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, most notably as explicated in his 1929 tome, Process and Reality. Process philosophy since then has been predominantly Whiteheadian and catalyzed via the Center for Process Studies. But there are non-Whiteheadian strands, such as those developed by Nicholas Richer and John Dupre. Though Whitehead is the paradigmatic process philosopher, we glimpse in the fragments of Heraclitus an ancient progenitor. Quote, all is flux, nothing is stationary. End quote. Flux, change, becoming, dynamicity, events, process, all antonyms here for purportedly underlying things. Things, in inverted commas, in process philosophy are mere conceptual and perceptual abstractions that mask intrinsic concrete dynamic processes. The white dot that we sometimes see amongst the stars masks the vast stormy process that we call Jupiter. The white dot that we sometimes see on our plants masks the vastly complex biological process that we call an aphid. Words such as Jupiter and aphid seem to gently push the belief in substance metaphysics because words are discrete units seemingly reflecting discrete things. The atom was conceived as the smallest of such things, notably by the ancient Greek thinker Democritus, his mentor Leucippus, and thereafter Epicurus and Lucretius. Thus can we symbolize the substance-process dichotomy under the opposition Democritus against Heraclitus. Substance. The concept substance has taken a number of meanings throughout the history of philosophy. In Western thought, these meanings are largely derived from Plato and Aristotle. Pier Francesco Basile, following Peter Forrest, has a useful list of these various meanings of substance, where the first two ultimately derive from Plato and the rest from Aristotle. Quote, 1. That which truly is. 2. That which is capable of action. 3. That which is always a subject of predication and never a predicate. 4. The underlying bearer of properties. 5. That which remains identical throughout change. 6. That which requires nothing else in order to exist. 7. That which is simple, that is, no substance has parts that are themselves substances. And 8. That which is not affected from without. End quote. This variety of definitions is ultimately not of necessity incongruous. It can be seen as a range of aspects of the same fundamental notion that substance is that which lies at the base of everything, that to which everything is ultimately reducible. In modern thought, we can note a few philosophies that are differentiated primarily upon their use of substance. Material monism, materialism, posits one type of substance, matter. Cartesian dualism posits two, matter and soul, and really for Descartes a third, God. Spinozism posits one substance, nature/God, synonyms for Spinoza. Leibniz posits an infinity of substances, which he calls monads, each of which perceptually reflect the universe in their own style. It is, however, materialism, as material monism, or material atomism, that process philosophy considers the paradigm of substance thinking. As the contemporary process philosopher Nicholas Riescher writes, quote, "Atomism is the quintessence of everything to which process philosophy is opposed." End quote. Again, we see the contrast, Democritus against Heraclitus. Though ancient, substance thought was solidified further when Galileo re-emphasized the purported division of reality into primary and secondary qualities, where the former was matter in terms of solidity, weight, extension, and so on, the latter mental qualities such as color, sound, and emotion. Descartes made the secondary qualities a substance, soul. John Locke accepted the division and the subsequent dualism, yet maintained that we humans did not really know what upheld or lay behind these two substances. Quote, "The idea, then, we have, to which we give the general name substance, being nothing but the supposed but unknown support of those qualities which we find existing, which we imagine cannot subsist without something to support them, we call that support substantia, which, according to the true import of the word, is, in plain English, standing under or upholding." End quote from Locke. Kant finally argued that we could never know that which lay behind the qualities we perceived. Despite Kant's influence and Locke's caution, it was the substance metaphysics of materialism that held sway as a default position through the Industrial Revolution, as fueled by thinkers such as Hobbes, Gassendi, de la Mettrie, and Baron d'Holbach. This metaphysics was adopted as foundation of what we today call science. Thus, process philosophy, though not anti-scientific, is meta-scientific, in the sense that its replacement of science's foundation with process offers a supposedly greater, more parsimonious overview of reality, with greater opportunities for knowledge. One example of such augmentation is Whitehead's influence upon the formation of the science of epigenetics via C.H. Waddington. Arguably, substance metaphysics is more conducive to the human mode of cognition. Substance thought has been bolstered by language and a cognitive bias towards spatialization. We shall break up and analyze these in turn before we approach process philosophy in more depth. We can differentiate two interwoven ways in which language conduces to substance thinking. Through 1, subject-predicate syntax, and 2, the noun-verb dichotomy. 1. Subject-predicate syntax. In a proposition such as, "the sun is bright," the sun, the subject, is rendered separate from the predicate, "is bright." This in turn leads one naturally to consider the subject to refer to a substance that is, as such, something distinct from the attributes referred to by the predicate. So the syntax seeds the idea that something, such as the sun, possesses attributes, such as brightness. Thus the idea is pushed, albeit unwittingly, that underlying changes in brightness, temperature, and such like, there exists an underlying, unchanging thing. This bifurcation of substance from attribute is reflected and fortified through predicate logic, such as every X is Y, and so on, which grounds much of modern thought and technology. The bifurcation grounds much religion in the sense of maintaining a mind-body dualism. The proposition "I think" ostensibly separates a soul from its actions. Moreover, retaining the same subject through propositions of morphing tense intimates underlying substance through time. Yet though useful and perhaps necessary as a condition for communication, syntax and morphology alone are insufficient to demonstrate that reality itself exists in such a divided state. Process philosophy argues that the so-called substance and attribute are one and the same process, falsely divided through such linguistic parsing. The brightness of the sun is a part or an aspect of the sun. It is not an attribute thereof, and the thinking makes the thinker in I think. Both essential and accidental attributes, so-called, are parts of a process. Moreover, for some process thinkers, the process that is the sun, its radiance, is part and parcel of the process that also involves its being perceived and other so-called effects on the environment, on its environment. Thus, even so-called relational properties are not separate from the subject and object, in addition to substance and attributes. These are also one process, divided linguistically yet not actually. Even the words cause and effect falsely divide what is in actuality a unified process. 2. The noun-verb distinction. As every schoolboy knows, a noun refers to a thing, whereas a verb refers to an action. Just as above, it seems that an adjective and an adverb refer to attributes of a thing. Certain languages, such as English, lay greater emphasis on nouns over verbs, thereby subconsciously promoting a substance metaphysics. Alan Watts argues that the Amerindian Nootka language, with its lack of nouns and adjectives in favor of verbs and adverbs, would more precisely represent the fluctuating actuality of the world. When we analyze the thing that a noun refers to, we find that a verb would be more appropriate. For process thought, a thing, so-called, is a process that has endured a certain form over time. Whitehead gives the example of the Egyptian stone obelisk Cleopatra's Needle in London. Though it appears to be a long-enduring, unchanging thing, it is in fact a heaving flurry of molecular, gravitational, electromagnetic activity that will one day pass away in its current form as an obelisk. In this extended overview, there is no difference in kind between an obelisk and a carnival, between a thing and an event. It is all event. To be is a verb. Spatialization. Our human visual system has in part evolved to outline spatial areas in our environment, distinguished by color variations. This visualization has a tendency to push the belief that a thing, so-called, exists as such according to the spatial figure that our vision cuts out of reality. In other words, our evolved visual faculty pushes the cognitive faculty into believing that reality is composed of extensive spatial segments, ultimately leading to atomism. Henri Bergson argues that in truth, quote, the distinct outlines which we see in an object and which give it its individuality are only the design of a certain kind of influence that we might exert on a certain point of space. It is the plan of our eventual actions, end quote. That is to say that there's a practical evolutionary advantage in seeing the world as composed of individual bits. But we must be careful to realize how we are being tricked by our biology. In truth, individuality extends beyond that which we see in space and in time. The sun is more than a sphere at a certain instant. In fact, considering the interfusion of all processes that make up nature, Bergson states that, quote, individuality admits of any number of degrees, and that it is not fully realized anywhere, even in man, end quote. Furthermore, Bergson argues that even our scientific understanding of time has been subjected to our spatial cognitive bias. Real time exists not as a spatial line, a timeline, but rather as the intuited duration that comprises our experience. To cut from such experience, which is always the accumulation of the past into the present via memory, to cut from this more bits, i.e. instants, is as artificial as cutting up the external world into bits, atomic particles, and so on. The world is not bitty, digital, but analog. Substance is not atoms and instants. Such belief is a practical ploy. Process is real. Process. What is process? The various aspects that address this question comprise the core elements of process philosophy. 1. Substance. This is added not to confuse, but to efface confusion. If substance is that which is fundamental, and if there is nothing more fundamental than change, event, or process itself, then one could say that process is substance. Even Whitehead writes that, quote, if we are to look for substance anywhere, I should find it in events which are in some sense the ultimate substance of nature, end quote. We should also note in this regard that when a profound thinker such as Leibniz uses the word substance, it does not thereby exclude him from a processual interpretation of substance. 2. Concrescence and transition. These are terms Whitehead coins to describe two types of change. Concrescence is internal change, transition is external change. Something, as it were, can change in itself, for example, as growth. Concrescence concerns a single actual entity, so-called, a fundamental process of reality, whereas transition concerns the change from one to more such actual entities. Concrescence is ultimately moved by final cause, as subjective aim, so-called, whereas transition is the vehicle of efficient cause. Thus, in Whitehead's process philosophy, we see the reintroduction of teleology into nature. He writes, quote, "A satisfactory cosmology must explain the interweaving of efficient and of final causation." End quote. Particles cannot explain purposes. 3. Organic systematization. Whitehead calls his process philosophy the philosophy of organism because he sees all processes as essentially of the same organic type as those exhibited by organisms. Both a mole and a molecule are organisms, existing as systems, what he calls societies, that maintain a form throughout a duration through systematic procedures. There is thus no organic-inorganic dichotomy. These self-systematic procedures transcend the limited notion of autopoiesis to include all entities, all of which have primal experiential elements that cannot be abstracted from their physiology, etc. In other words, organism is the paradigmatic process. 4. Real time. As opposed to the spatial timeline and the instant so frequently employed by substance metaphysics, as aforementioned in relation to Bergson, process philosophers do not consider time to be an illusion, but to be central to actuality. In contradistinction to physicists such as Einstein and certain idealists such as McTaggart, who argue for the unreality of time, process philosophers generally accept and accentuate it. As Bergson comments, physics cannot accommodate the speed of time, the direction of time, the species present, the duration of the present, and it cannot distinguish the past from the present and future, all of which are essential to what time is. Further still, Whitehead adds that at a so-called instant, many qualities essential to actualities are lost, for instance, velocity, direction, and momentum. An instant is an abstraction, a piece cut out and ripped from reality. It is the elucidation of such cognitive violence that makes for the attraction of process philosophy. To quote Bertrand Russell, Dr. Whitehead has done more than any other author to show the need of undoing the abstraction of physics. End quote. One tool that Whitehead employs for such undoing is his fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Concepts and percepts, by their very nature, pick out certain qualities and always exclude others, so we must urge caution when considering a concept to sufficiently map concrete actuality. Temporal instants and spatial particles are both such abstractions. Whitehead writes that, quote, "Undoubtedly molecules and electrons are abstractions, but to be an abstraction does not mean that an entity is nothing. It merely means that its existence is only one factor of a more concrete element of nature. The molecule is really in the event, in the same sense as the grin is really on the cat's face." End quote. We may add that, like the Cheshire Cat's floating grin, instants, timelines, and any notions of the reversibility of time all belong in Wonderland. 5. Contextualism. If a finite delimited thing is an abstraction, then the concrete reality is a process that flows spatially and temporally beyond its hub and as such interweaves with all other processes. Essential to a process is other processes, none stand in isolation. An atom, so-called, is an abstraction that in its concreteness includes the environmental forces acting and reacting upon it. It changes with and is dependent upon its environment. This atomic process is everything. There is no unchanging substantial atom lying beneath this process. This is the abstraction. Thus, in a different scenario, an atom is a different entity, a different process. Whitehead extends this wisdom from atoms to genes. Quote, "Geneticists conceive genes as the determinants of heredity. The analogy of the old concept of matter, abstract isolated particles, sometimes leads them to ignore the influence of the particular animal body in which they are functioning." End quote. Epigenetics ensued. 6. Realism. Though each subject of experience has their own way of perceiving the world, process philosophy, at least in Whitehead's pivotal manner, is not idealism. The processes perceived by processes such as ourselves exist mind independently. From Bergson and Whitehead, the relation of sensor to the sensed is no longer one of subject to representation, but one of part to whole. What we sense, we sensors, becomes part of the process that we are. Again, there is no concrete subject-predicate distinction between I and my perceptions, and my identity is not limited to the abstract spatial outline of my body. I am in part that which I see, and what I see is in part of me. The intersecting Venn diagram better represents the subject-object relation than does some causal arrow between the separated two. But here we further note that perception itself is causation. The influx of the object is a process both perceived and causal. The distinction is another product of misplaced concreteness. Thus does Whitehead refute Hume's rejection of the ability to directly perceive causation. Thus we directly perceive the real world, realism. Finally, 7. Creativity and novelty. Believing in the abstractions that are particles, instants, and constants led substance thinkers into determinism, that one can hypothetically determine the future as the status of such entities could be known, e.g. by Laplace's demon. Determinism thus rejects any freedom of action, any real creation of novel phenomena that could not be theoretically determined in advance. But when we see through the abstractions, such determinism begins to weaken. Furthermore, we see that it is our consciousness that has created these abstractions, and thus does not behove the created to determine the creator. Further still, so-called constants or laws of nature are also, for many process thinkers, abstractions that in actuality are also subject to fluctuation. The laws of physics are regularities observed over certain durations of time, nothing more. Even these are subject to change. Consequently, the future cannot be determined, and thus creativity reigns, even above the gods for Whitehead. For Whitehead, the electromagnetic era in which we exist will pass. Even the three-dimensional spatial universe is subject to change. The future is theoretically unpredictable, and the possibilities for experience are infinite.